This one's going to be a good one. I'm going to show you something that's actually useful. Yay! Winning! So I got to ask the question, how do I overcome my meltdowns? You know, how do I stop myself from just, I'm going along, everything is fine, and I just come crashing back down to earth? This lady asked me. And I said, so you were going along and everything was fine, and then you came crashing back down to earth? Yes. Okay, well, you better tell me what actually happened. Tell me what that actually means in the real world. Let's get specific, because the frame that you've put around it is you were going along, you were doing okay, and then out of the blue, bolt from the blue, boom, you just come crashing back down to earth. Tell me what actually happened. So what transpired in this story is that this lady's husband had been late to come and pick her up, and she went into an emotional flashback, and she had a little bit of a meltdown and became disproportionately angry and critical and got a bit nasty. Okay, so I've had experience of this in myself, and I've got experience of this in interacting in relationships with other people, as well as professionally working with clients. So I'm going to try and not use too much jargon in this video. If you regularly find yourself, quote unquote, having meltdowns or coming crashing back down to earth, please bear with me. You do need to understand a little bit of jargon, but I'll ease you into it. So the jargon that I'm going to use is something that is called complex PTSD. And what this means is that when somebody has experienced invisible abuse in their childhood in the form of subtle, covert, emotional and psychological bullying and domination and triangulation and splitting and this kind of thing over a long period of time, that's invisible abuse, emotional abuse, they end up with invisible wounds, invisible scars, psychological pain points, if you like, upon the mental body, the emotional body that can be, when poked, when touched, hurt a lot. There you go. I managed to explain it without too much jargon there. And we call this complex PTSD, which was identified as something which is different to standard PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which you'd usually associate with combat veterans or people who've been involved in violent crime, things like that. And what we're finding nowadays, as psychology is progressing and moving forward, is that there is some overlap there, and there is overlap between post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and certain personality issues that can come up, certain disorders, certain symptoms and traits that are showing up. If you frequently find yourself having meltdowns and you find that you are fairly sensitive and that you can have a disproportionate reaction to small events that are not consistent. You know, one day you might be fine with, for example, your boyfriend doesn't text you as quickly as you think he should, text you back as quickly as you think he should. One day it doesn't bother you at all, and then the next day it just drives you mad. We call these, in the context of somebody who has experienced emotional abuse, and you might not be sure if you have or not. You might not be sure about much at all. That can often be a sign that you've been emotionally abused, is that your ability to be sure about anything is damaged. So you might not be sure. You might be like, oh, this kind of sounds like me, but you know, my parents put a roof over my head, they didn't pull out my fingernails, they didn't put cigarettes out on my eyelids or anything like that, so I couldn't really consider myself to have been abused. The other fun and exciting and a tricky, difficult element from a coaching perspective of all this is that complex PTSD absolutely can develop in adulthood. It is not only for children who are raised in adverse environments. It's anything where you feel like you can't escape. You could potentially, put extra syllables in there, develop a form of complex PTSD from being emotionally abused by a boss in a job that you just can't afford to leave. So you need to feel trapped, or at least perceive that you're trapped. It needs to take place over a long period of time, and you need to continuously be put into psychological double binds, which I've touched on in other videos I won't get into here. So how do we overcome these quote-unquote meltdowns? Well, for a start, we can stop calling them meltdowns. We can stop saying, oh, I just came crashing back down to earth, like a bolt from the blue. It's very important when people are recovering from abuse that they have the power and the permission and the ability to call abuse abuse and say, hey, that did happen. It is the first step in the long and rocky road to recovery, is to say, hey, that was pretty fucked up, that was not okay, that was immoral and possibly even illegal, and that should not have happened, and people around who knew that it was happening should not have let that happen. It was wrong. It was abuse. So you need to have the ability to call abuse abuse, but you also need to have the ability to call the symptomatic responses of that emotional abuse what they are. So let's stop saying, oh, I keep having meltdowns, or oh, I'm a bit emotionally unstable, or oh, I'm just a bit fragile, or hypersensitive, or whatever, you know, tinted with the moral judgment these sort of frames come with, and that moral judgment really isn't going to help, especially if you do have complex PTSD. If you do find yourself with a strong leaning towards emotional dysregulation, you're up and down all the time, and sometimes you can cope and sometimes you can't. Any kind of moral judgment, this is a further level of trickiness. This is why it's called complex PTSD, not simple PTSD or fun times cure easily PTSD. It's you know, you have to do, in order to deal with a client with complex PTSD, it's like doing a really complicated ballet dance through a minefield where the mines are constantly shifting position all the time. But it is possible to fix it, to help other people to fix it in themselves, and indeed to assist ourselves in fixing it. I know, because I have done it, and I'm doing it with other people. You know, I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm cured of it, but I'm in a much, much better position now than I was a few years ago. And one of the biggest things, the biggest pieces of advice I can give you as somebody who did frequently have meltdowns, which is an expression you now are not going to use, you're going to, at least when you're talking to yourself, you're going to call it an emotional flashback. You must be able to call an emotional flashback an emotional flashback. And the first step on the road to recovery to emotional flashbacks is to say, hey, this is an emotional flashback, yo. This isn't really me. This isn't actually how I feel about this situation. This is not me calm, rational, balanced and feeling good. This is me treating this situation in this way because it looks like another situation. So you ever see somebody or see yourself get angry or upset about a thing that looks like another thing that they're actually really upset about? So their boss tells them at work, you know, you get to do your presentation at the meeting, and they're really excited about doing it, and at the very last minute he's just like, no, we haven't got time for that, and he's really dismissive about it, and he does this with his hand and this with his face, because suddenly he's French. Your boss is French now. Bouf. Je m'en fous. Bouf. So you're suddenly not allowed to do it. I've really tripped myself out now. Dissociating. I'm dissociating. This is another emotional flashback trait now I'm thinking about. I'm creating a story about a French boss. This is the cool thing with complex PTSD, by the way, or one of the things with it, is it can actually create people who are generally quite creative types. Most of the creative types who are out there will have elements of complex PTSD. Their creativity was actually a coping mechanism for dealing with unpleasantness. So imagine that happens to you. The French boss goes, bof, je m'en fous. You're not allowed to do your presentation just because there's no time. He's not like, oh, we really don't have time. I value what you've got to say, but there is no time. He just dismisses you. And you freak out, either internally, depending on your trauma response type. I don't want to overwhelm you with gobbledygook jargon, but there are different styles of responding. There are different flavors of meltdown, should we call it. There are 4 flavors of meltdown. You might be the type of person who goes into fawning, meaning you try and negotiate your way out of it. Fighting, meaning you just get really angry and you want to break something or punch somebody, or fawn a little bit as well. So there's fawning, fight, flight, you just want to run away. Or you freeze, you just completely go into shocked mode, total helplessness, there's nothing I can do, spiral into yourself down into a deep dark chasm of doom where nothing can ever get better ever again. And it's so deep and so powerful that it pulls light, and light and time bends into it, the power of its vacuousness. It's like a singularity of doom, a singularity of infinite gravity of doom. So these are all the different flavors of meltdown that you can have, the 4 different flavors, and then they have sub flavors based on that. But it's not a meltdown, you're not hypersensitive, these are emotional flashbacks. So the first thing to do is say, I am having an emotional flashback, this ain't really me. And the second thing to do is to acknowledge, hey, when flashbacks occur, just like the standard PTSD that we're all aware of through films and the media, I tried to watch Jacob's Ladder again the other day. Oh my god, it's about 15 minutes of it and I was like, I can't deal with this. But that was quite a famous film about somebody who had PTSD after the Vietnam War. So a very standard, common thing is for somebody who has been in a war zone, they will have PTSD, and they will also have complex PTSD as well. It overlaps. And then if they hear a car backfiring or firecrackers going off, or there was a guy, I was a kid and he was an adult, but there was a sports club and we were always going to the sports club, and he was like a manager there, and he'd been raised in Angola. And when somebody popped, if somebody ever popped, so people got onto it. It was the 80s. It wasn't like a very politically correct time. People weren't very sensitive back then. People got onto the idea that if you popped a bottle of champagne behind him, he would jump under a table. Yeah, so it's a very standard PTSD response, a sense of constant threat, a sense of constantly being under pressure. I recently went to Bosnia and Croatia, spent some time in Sarajevo, where you can literally still see in the houses and everything around. Come up on here then. You can see bullet holes everywhere and mortar marks outside of people's houses on the pavement. They'll go, oh, there's a mortar pattern that killed so-and-so, you know, my grandmother's sister, my da-da-da. And it creates an environment where people, a long-lasting impression at the emotional and psychological level of a lack of safety. You can't just tease people like that. Come on, they need to see you now because they've heard you click-clacking around in your high heels. Are you even in shot? Just. Oh, you're a good boy. See how he poses. Look at the camera. Do blue steel. 1, 2, 3. No? Okay then. And the long-term effect of that is that there are people still with very serious psychological and physical problems in that country. It's 25 years later. The signs of the invasion, of the genocide, are still all around, and that has a long-lasting impact. It slows people's ability to move forward. It slows people's ability to expand. Once you've gone into huge crisis mode, huge trauma, massive levels of unsafety and change and horror and noise and darkness and violence. I mean, at every level, violence, physical, psychological, emotional, political violence, and then, you know, the abandonment by the rest of the world, by the rest of Europe, in the case of the Balkans, where people knew that it was going on and really didn't do a massive amount. So that then creates, at the macro level, at the national level, at the political level, if you like, at the cultural level, something that happens at the micro level in an individual. Pete Walker wrote a great book about this. It's called Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, and he calls that the abandonment mélange. Le mélange. So where loss, pain, trauma, terror, you know, all of the and abandonment, they come and they just hit you all in one go. And then you're wondering why you walk around. You can go to the supermarket, see somebody who looks like somebody you used to know 30 years ago, and then you don't function properly for the rest of the day. You spiral into depression, or what I've frequently seen with people with cptsd, especially where violence is the root of it, massive anxiety, just living in a constant state of anxiety, waiting for the bombs to drop, waiting for something awful to happen. So when you're looking to overcome these things, you need to look at what is it that has really happened, what is it that is really going on inside of you. Stroking a dog helps. When they fart, it's not as good. Max has actually been very good today. He's on camera, he's holding it in, that's all that's happening. So you need to identify the real cause of what these things are, and say, you know, this is an emotional flashback. An emotional flashback, when we think of PTSD, like if you watch a movie where the former Marine who's just come back from Iraq gets freaked out every time he, I don't know, I was watching a TED talk the other day, every time the dude drove down the road, and he went back to, I don't know, wherever he lived, like Idaho, somewhere in like in the middle of America. He's 24 years old, and he found he couldn't drive down the sides of the road. So he would drive up the middle of the road when he was back home in America after a tour in Afghanistan, because he was frightened of the IEDs on the side of the road. So what's been burned into his central nervous system is the sides of the road are very, very dangerous. So you might be sat there going, I can't conflate what I have, you know, in terms of like, you know, mummy didn't cuddle me enough with some guy who's worrying about his arms and legs being blown off. Yes, except that you can, because at the level of the central nervous system, at the level of the most primitive parts of the human being, as it functions, there is no differentiation in threat when you're a child. So if this occurred in childhood, and for most people with cptsd, you know, it might be provoked in adulthood, but there's usually a root frequently in childhood. There is no ego. So you can't say, this isn't me. This is me, and that is you. So if you do that, that's you doing it. It's all me. It's all part of the same me. So if you are forced to run in between buildings in Sarajevo as a child, whilst parents and adults scream at you to run as fast as you can, because soldiers, grown adult men in uniform, are sniping at you to kill you, civilians, women, children, everybody, your brain at that age can't say, well, you know, this is a tragic situation, there are various political and cultural forces at play here. You know, you can't do that. It's all you. It's all happening to you, and everything is you, because you're in that state of narcissism as a child, so that when the sun comes up in the morning, when you wake up and you open your eyes, that's the sun turning on. And when you go to sleep and you shut your eyes, the sun, the moon and everything switches off as well. Because you are the centre of the universe. You're the single point of consciousness at the centre of the universe when you are a child. It's as you get older, you go, oh, there's other people here. And then, you know, hopefully as you grow older and individuate and get healthy, you let go of the idea of being the centre of the universe. If you don't, you get stuck on that. You can develop narcissistic, you know, heavy narcissistic personality traits. So it's not about who suffered the most or what's worse. I've seen terrible pain inflicted by warfare. There's a story that was on the Street Fight Secrets channel of a guy who contacted me when I was still just a self-defense instructor, using psychological principles, a guy who'd served in the special forces, who had been involved in the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. I don't know what he saw. I don't know what he experienced. He didn't tell me. But he said, and this could all, I could be making this up, he could be making this up, it could all just be bullshit. But as I sit here now, I think he was telling me the truth. He said that he was defying, his doctors had told him he was defying medical science, because the sheer amount of barbiturates, downers, they were pumping into him to get him to switch off, wasn't switching him off. He was so hyper-vigilant, so hyper-adrenalized, that his body could take powerful barbiturates that should have put him to sleep and gone, really? Yeah, fuck you, and kicked it out. I need to stay awake, because if I don't stay awake, I want to be captured and, you know, tortured, and something awful is going to happen. To a degree, at the most primitive parts of the mind, something awful is going to happen. Doesn't really matter what it is. One thing isn't worse than the other. You know, if you're a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, and your father comes home drunk and screams at your mother and beats her, and you feel shame, guilt, helplessness, terror, you're flooded with adrenaline, it could be less awful than extremely violent situations. I know, I've lived it. I've had a group of guys when I was doing security work turn on me and you know, try and beat the shit out of me for I was the wrong colour, you know, I think. I said something that they thought I didn't have the right to say because I wasn't the right colour, so they were trying to kill me. And I walked away from that laughing, and it wasn't, you go, well, that's bravado. It wasn't bravado. I'll explain to you what it is. And I went to sleep that night. I slept like a baby, didn't bother me. But situations that I've had in a family unit where, you know, just having pressure from parents haunt me even to this day, that I have to deal with. I got glassed in the face by somebody who thought I was gay, so he glassed me in the face and didn't really. I had about 3 months worth of problems, and then it just went away. So where does this kind of trauma take place? What's the important element of the trauma? The important element of the trauma is shock. It's shock. There are two ways to burn a message into the central nervous system. If you're suffering from complex PTSD or PTSD, there is a message in the system which is reality isn't safe and people aren't safe. PTSD and CPTSD is the same in that regard. Reality isn't safe, people aren't safe. I'm not, and I'm not safe. I'm not, people are dangerous. Reality is dangerous. The world is a bad place, and I'm not safe, I'm not safe, I'm not safe is the core message. How do you burn any message into the central nervous system? If you're training a soldier to get up and to fight, so that if he's in the deepest sleep, or he's going to the bathroom, or he's doing something that is completely state changing, where if a stimulus occurs where suddenly he's under attack and he's told to fight, before he's even thought, he's picking up his weapon, he's got no conscious thought about it whatsoever, he's checking it, he's making sure it's ready to go, he's looking for his rounds, and then he is shooting at, he's finding something to attack. Where is the general direction of the enemy? I think they're over there, okay, let's just send some badness that way, within seconds. Max did not keep his promise, he fighted. I was about to tell the next part of my story, so I excitedly sucked in air. Wow. So how do we do that? We do that through repetition. Repetition is way number one. So if every time the front door closes, your father, stepfather, stepmother, mother, evil older brother comes home and beats the shit out of you, and they do that 200 times over 2 years, then you will learn to fear the sound of a closing front door. I still do. I still have an emotional response to that. Whereas I can have zero, I'm coming back to the second thing, I can have zero, I need to close a loop that I opened earlier, zero response to a guy standing in front of me screaming at me, telling me he's going to stab me and bite my ear off and spit it down my throat, and I could just be like, whatever. The thing that makes a difference is shock. If you have software in place that is ready to deal with what is in front of you, you'll be okay. You won't be okay, but the psychological studies are in, the results are in, and they're pretty positive that what is the difference that makes a difference between somebody getting traumatized and somebody not getting traumatized long term. Everybody's going to be traumatized to a degree by horror, but traumatized long term and a good rate of recovery is shock. Were they ready for it? Whatever that guy I spoke to in the Special Forces saw in the Balkans during the war, whatever it was, he wasn't ready for it. Now, I'm not going to sit here and give you graphic descriptions. As I say, I visited Sarajevo to learn, partly to learn, to experience the place, and I read up online, and I've got a fairly strong stomach, but it's heavy. It's really, really, really heavy. But I'm not going to sit here and keep those images and those ideas alive by telling you them. But there's things that happen there that were reasonably unprecedented in modern warfare, even in some of the. I'm just not going to get into it. So he wasn't ready for what he saw, and nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. I imagine he didn't tell. He might have even experienced it. He might have actually been captured. I don't know. All I know is there's a guy out there. I hope he's recovering. I spoke to him 6-7 years ago now. I hope he's getting better. Who told me that the drugs didn't work. He was too hypervigilant, too switched on, and too adrenalized. If he wanted to sleep for 3 or 4 hours, he would put on a pack. I don't know, like a 15-20 kilo pack, whatever they run around with, something heavy, and then he would take himself for like a 20-mile jog. And he said the physical exhaustion of that, he could come back and probably get 3 or 4 hours of twitchy sleep. So back to the meltdown. What's happening there? What's happening over here is the same as over there. Don't think, oh, this is a first world problem and this is a real world problem. Don't shame yourself into thinking this isn't a big deal. To the mind of a child, it was a very big deal. To the mind of a child, it was as life and death as a guy who sat in a trench wondering if the next mortar is going to be his or not. It's the same. It's not the same at the objective level as we sit here as adults, comfortable, warm and dry, well fed, going, oh yes, everything is fucking peachy, this is an interesting bit of psychology. The level of doom and threat and terror that would be imposed on a child will be the same. The central nervous system is going to respond as though the threat is exactly the same. You've topped out on terror. You couldn't be more adrenalized than that, and you're 4 or 5 years old. That's what I'm saying is doing the damage. Plus, the idea that PTSD and CPTSD don't overlap is silly. It's a silly idea, and we will do, well, they need to accept CPTSD first, and then they'll accept that most of your combat veterans do have CPTSD. How do I know? I need to do more research. I'm researching it now, but there is a tendency, I am going to disappear off into gobbledygook for people who understand psychological terms. Just for 1 second, there is a tendency for combat veterans to display a much higher chance of registering positive for borderline personality disorder when tested. The piece of research that I looked at said 80%. 80% of combat vets register positive for borderline personality disorder. Something I found out very recently, because I had to, because I effectively lived with a combat veteran, is that they are, if they have the PTSD, simple PTSD, they're very difficult to live with. They become emotionally dysregulating and can drive their partners to the nervous breakdown point, and effectively start to give their partners PTSD because their behaviour is so up and down in and of itself. So why would it be like that? Because of CPTSD. There's a big overlap here, is my point. And you can't really understand one without understanding the other. So how do we overcome these emotional meltdowns? We need to have compassion for ourselves. Pete Walker calls this in his book self-compassion. It's just as important as self-championing and self-assertion. You need to say, hey, I didn't consent to this. I didn't consent to being raised in that environment. I didn't consent to being treated this way. These things are wrong. This is abuse. And now I live with the consequence of that abuse. There is an imprint that was left on my central nervous system that is overpowering, that I need to do something about, that's giving me a hair trigger response to certain situations. The second thing is to say there are triggers and there are flashbacks. What's my trigger? If my husband is late to pick me up, what's happening? Well, my mind, the golem inside of my head is telling me he doesn't really love me, nobody really loves me, I'm unlovable, I've been abandoned yet again, I trusted, I should never have trusted anybody, it was a mistake to trust, I'll never trust again, I'll be look out, that's what it does, that's what the brain does. It's the little game it plays. The second thing, by the way, that imprints on the central nervous system is the level of trauma. So repetition imprints on the central nervous system and the level of trauma. So I can either give you a really horrendous experience once and leave an imprint there, or I can go through it 200 times with you and leave an imprint there. And I've done all this with people. When I was a self-protection instructor, the reason why the guy contacted me was because I was so focused on combative psychology. And he said to me, I would rather take advice from you. And I was like, it's got to be more like, I remember the house I was in, I must have been 28, which means it's 11 years ago. And I was shitting myself. I was thinking, and I just said to the guy, dude, appreciate the call. I'll talk to you whenever you want to talk to me. But this is way above my pay grade. I don't know what the problem is and I don't know how to fix it. I know that there must be an anchor, because I was more into NLP in those days. I would say you're anchored to a certain response, it's triggering a psychological state, that's where I would start, and I'd go from there. And he said, yeah, okay, I appreciate that you don't really understand it. I was talking so loud you didn't hear that, did you? He literally just went, you're shameless. Shameless. Oh my god, that stinks. Back in the day, it used to be just a polite little tss. Now it's comic book, like comedy fart noises. I wish I wasn't talking so loud. Maybe if you play that back, you might just have heard it. So what the guy was telling me is that the psychiatrists he was talking to were not helping him. All they were doing is medicating him because they didn't know how. Then they were just saying to him, we don't know what to do with you, but give you more drugs. And the drugs we're giving you, these should be knocking you out, and there aren't. We've never heard of that before. It's unheard of. This shouldn't be happening. Testament to human biology and what humans can adapt to, but also a testament to how the human machine, the human system, when it gets stuck in a certain mode, it's hard to knock it out of that mode. And PTSD, like CPTSD, to me, the metaphor that I use is there is a house alarm that is broken and it's on all the fucking time. We need to find a way to switch it off, or at least turn it down to make it bearable to live inside that house. A house alarm that is on all the time, by the way, is no longer functioning as an alarm. It's just a baseline state of anxiety and hypervigilance. So my point with expressing that metaphor is your brain is telling you this is how to be safe. It ain't. If you're always hypervigilant, you're always burnt out. If you're always hypervigilant, everything is a threat, therefore nothing is a threat. You're not responding to threats anymore because you can't see what's a genuine threat and what's not. What you're going to end up doing is just massive amounts of self-isolation, and I've lived that as well. So that's the two ways of that it gets burned into the central nervous system. And I did this with people when I was a combatives instructor. I would show them ways. I was young, I didn't really realise how dangerous what I was doing was. I was given a remit. I was told, people don't feel like they're capable of doing violence, they have reservations about defending themselves because they don't want to hurt their attacker, etc, etc. Can you fix that? And I went, yeah, sure, I can fix it. And what I actually did was it's kind of a trauma bonding process that people could do on themselves, where they would create a split in their personality that would make them more violent and more capable of committing acts of violence. And I would warn them. I would say, I've done this, I've experienced it, I experimented with myself first, it works, but guess what? You know, there's bleed over. You don't get to just be like a nice, normal, civilized person and then at the drop of the hat get to be Mr. or Mrs. Nasty. No, you're going to have really violent dreams. I'm sure if you got tested, your T levels would go up, your testosterone levels will go up, and you will be more aggressive and confrontational because that's what you're practicing to do inside of your head. So, meltdowns, what are they? Meltdowns in reality are emotional flashbacks. Maybe you could be more disruptive. Is there anything else? They're emotional flashbacks, they're not meltdowns. We should call them what they are because that's how we will help to overcome them. And the other point of this video was to say, look, there is an overlap between PTSD and complex PTSD, but I do believe all these things can be fixed. The process is, call an emotional flashback a flashback. I've said it like 5 times now and you've gone, yeah, but that's too easy. It's the fucking key. It's the absolute key is to say, this is an emotional flashback that I'm having right now. The truth of what is going on is this is not me, this is an emotional flashback. Okay, now what? Part number 2, look at the trigger. What was the trigger? My husband didn't show up on time. My girlfriend didn't get me the medicine. I told her that, you know, she knows I have a prescription and it needs picking up every Tuesday, and she promised to get it for me and she forgot to get it for me, so therefore she doesn't love me. Or my boss got a bit French and went, bof, je m'en fous, because I was supposed to do my presentation. I didn't. What was it? What is that? And then the third step would be say, well, what does that thing look like from before? I'm really upset about this because it feels to me at the internal subjective level like another scenario that really hurt me in the past. And you can start from there. Once you've got a grip of that and you've got a hold of that, you should start looking at simple state management. Step 4 would be state management. You know, people with complex PTSD, people who are prone to meltdowns, you can't afford to do what other people do. You can't. You can't drink like they do. You can't eat like they do. You can't take drugs like they do. You skip sleep like they do. You just can't. Like, if you can identify and you can say, okay, this complex PTSD thing seems like me, you got to take extra care to look after your health, to look after your state, you know, boring stuff. Stay hydrated, eat good food, lay off the caffeine, lay off, you know, stay away from triggers. Don't watch violent movies, don't read violent books, don't go to places where people are shit-faced drunk, falling all over each other like something out of a zombie movie. You know, and if you do, take stock of it and just go, well, I'm not going to respond the same way as everybody else does to this. Everybody else is fine here because they don't know how under threat they really, really are, you know, for example. But yeah, state management is also hugely important. Eat right, exercise right, get your sleep, you know, all of these things. If you're not feeling good physically, you're going to be a lot more prone to get into emotional flashbacks. The 5th and last piece of advice that I would give you is you can't manage your interpersonal relationships like other people do. You can't be sloppy and haphazard. You know, a lot of you watching this will be like, well, I'm already in a long-term relationship. Younger people who are pre-long-term relationship probably won't watch a video like this. Those are a little bit older, a little bit smarter, like, there's actually something I need to fix here. You've probably at the point where like, I've suffered enough drama, I want it to stop now. It's not fun and interesting and exciting. It's actually pretty boring and I want it to stop. You've got to be at that point to watch this video. Well then, you know, if you're getting into a relationship with somebody and you're in the early phases of it, realize that the more intimate you get with them, the more vulnerable you become. The more vulnerable you become. Jesus, Freudian slip again. The more vulnerable you become. The more vulnerable you become, the more vulnerable you feel, the more prone to emotional flashbacks you are. Intimate relationships are hugely provocative for people with CPTSD and PTSD as well. Vulnerability is a provocation. You were abused in a vulnerable state. If you were lying in the bottom of a slit trench, you know, pissing yourself, hoping that you weren't going to die from having your head blown open, or you were a child hiding under the bed, pissing yourself, hoping that you weren't going to die from having your head kicked open, it's the same root state of vulnerability, of helplessness that you're experiencing. And that vulnerability is unfortunately necessary for coaching and for intimate relationships. There can be no intimacy and no love without vulnerability. So the fifth piece of advice I gave you was to manage your relationships, and I guess the sixth piece of advice would be learn how to do vulnerability. If you want to emotionally mature and heal and get past all this, you need to find a structured way in which you can push yourself through the pain barrier of vulnerability, and be open and be exposed and not be armoured and on the defence all the time. When I say manage your interpersonal relationships, I started to say if you're in the beginning of an interpersonal relationship, it's an intimate one, realise that you're going to be provoked a lot. You're probably going to be a bit of a dick. You might wind the other person up. You'll be up and down. You'll get emotionally dysregulated. There will be turbulence as you get closer. If you're already in a long-term relationship with somebody, say, hey, I need you to watch this fucking video with this fucking Scouse guy. He's going to talk a lot of shit, but you got to listen to him. He's got some shit to say. What are you going to do? So get them to listen to this. And what I would say to the partners of people is you can have a very good, very loyal, very intensely loving and quite a moral human being to be in a relationship with here. Lucky you, there ain't too many of them around, and they'll be generally more thoughtful, more philosophical about life in general because they've been through more. But this person is, depending on where they're at in their recovery, could be like, you know, a time bomb waiting to go off because of different things that they've been through that have left them with all these hot buttons on them that you can accidentally push. And you can say to yourself, okay, well, I'll make an effort not to push those buttons. Okay, well, as soon as you make an effort not to push those buttons, that pushes a button because they'll sense you're pulling away and that pushes a button. You know, if you go and Google online, what's it like having a relationship with a person with PTSD or a person with borderline or a person with CPTSD, you will find a lot of people complaining bitterly about it because it can be very, very tough. If the two of you work together to identify the triggers and to ameliorate the triggers and to talk through emotional flashbacks as emotional flashbacks, you will develop trust, you will develop healthier boundaries, and you can find a way to move forward and it will get better. It will ameliorate, things will improve. I've seen it time and again. If you don't discuss emotional flashbacks as flashbacks and you just call them meltdowns, and you just say to the person, well, sometimes you're just a bitch or sometimes you're just a fucking asshole, man, then that's it's gonna make the situation worse. PTSD and CPTSD does not get better on its own over time, it gets worse. So you need help. If you're the partner of somebody with this, you got to help them and you got to work together. That doesn't mean you're a pushover. One of the useful phrases I learned from studying people with borderline personality disorder, somebody with CPTSD doesn't have borderline personality disorder. It's not the same, but it looks the same. They fall into the same cluster of, it's like the diagnostic structure that is used looks at certain traits, like does the person, does the client, patient become aggressive when intimacy is withdrawn? Do they become self-pitying and self-destructive when they are seen to be in the wrong? This kind of thing. Well, that, CPTSD, yes. PTSD, yes. Looks just like borderline. Oh shit. That means these guys all have, it's wrong. It's the wrong way to approach it. It's a new area in psychology. Psychologists are not doing amazingly well. Don't get mad at me. Psychologists who are doing well, or people who've been psychologists are doing well. The thick end of the wedge, the large majority of people who have CPTSD and PTSD aren't being treated very well out there. There aren't hugely high levels of success rates because the models that the psychology community is using to attack this issue are wrong. The model is just wrong. It couldn't possibly work. When it does work, it's because the client is so keen to make it work that they'll do anything to get better, and you know, they're the ones who do all the healing, really, and then the psychologist can take the credit for that. But 9 times out of 10, it just doesn't work. There are very skilled people out there who've had great success rates. And sometimes those success rates are up and down. They can get like a really good response right after the therapy session, and then the person goes right the way back to where they were 6 months, 12 months later. So, if you're in a relationship with somebody who has these kinds of symptoms, you should both be talking about it. You should be describing it as emotional flashbacks, and don't personalize it. Don't be like, well, you're just the type of person who X. Well, you're just the type of person who Y. They're not. Though they have been up until now, and all the evidence points to the contrary. These are emotional flashbacks, they're defense responses, they are extremely unpleasant, they can even be violent and outright abusive. You know, and once, you know, I'm not saying have boundaryless compassion or engage in boundaryless giving. At some point you do have to say no, which brings me back to the acronym for dealing with people with borderline personality disorder, which is SET, support, empathy, and truth. So you have to have the approach of saying, yes, I support you, I'm empathic for your pain, but the truth is you're acting like a bit of a bell end right now and I need you to stop. You don't have to hold back on the truth. They can take it. They can take a boundary. They want boundaries. They want to know that you're not going to leave them. You're definitely not going to leave them. That's the baseline. Nobody's leaving anybody, but you have to fucking stop doing this. And it's tough. It's tough. It's hard going, and it can be very draining unless both of you. It's not down to one person. Both of you need to work in the right direction. Okay, I think that is enough. Max, come back up here, but no pooping. Up. Yes. Have your final. Yeah, take your time. Nobody's waiting for you, mate. Look, because when they can hear your feet clacking on the floor and they don't see you, it creates like a sense of a lack of conclusion, and that lack of conclusion is, you know, it's unfulfilling, it's annoying. It's like when somebody leaves and they don't tell you why they left. And now Max has twigs in his ears. Wonderful. Okay, ladies and gents, that was supposed to be 5 minutes. It definitely wasn't. Thank you very much for your time and your attention and your patience with that one. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.